Trump telling the Europeans now that they have to, if they want United States to put more sanctions on Russia, then they have to go full in. That is, put secondary sanctions on anyone trading with Russia, buying their energy, which means going after China, India. This is, I've heard, different interpretations and perspectives on what the strategy is here. Is this a foolish, delusional approach, or is this some 4D chess we're not understanding?
No, I think that's a great question, because whenever people in the United States listen to something that Donald Trump says that frankly doesn't pass the smell test for common sense, the immediate fallback position is, oh, well, this must be a clever way to extricate the United States from something or put the United States in the driver's seat, so forth. I prefer to listen to the man and go along with what you see, as opposed to what you think he may mean. This message that he said to the Europeans struck me as a sort of a passive-aggressive approach to dealing with international relations that I think is both unhelpful and dangerous. I mean, he starts off by saying, I've decided to, quote-unquote, do sanctions on Russia. It sounded like a valley girl from Central California explaining what she plans to do for the day, and do lunch, do dinner, whatever else. Then he goes on to tell us that, well, I'm going to impose sanctions, but everything depends on you in Europe, and I expect that you will follow my lead. Well, he forgets something. You know, George Washington, when he was president of the United States, responded to a question about the French and what they would do in the future and what we might do in the future. And he said, keep something in mind. No nation or no nation state can be expected to move beyond the limits of its own interests. And that was his answer to the question, what will the French do? What will the British do? What will anybody do? And he did not expect anyone to move beyond the limits of their interests in their support of us. In other words, whatever the policy is, it has limitations. And I think as the Europeans read through his message, they're going to come to the conclusion that he wants them to fully commit to national or international suicide by destroying their relations with virtually everybody except the United States and between themselves. And this is not a reasonable solution in today's world. We all live on the same planet. It is in everyone's interest at some point to do business, regardless of the various political systems that each country embraces. So I think the notion that somehow or another the Europeans are going to say, you know, you're right. To be successful in Ukraine, which is, of course, an utterly absurd notion anyway, what we need to do now is cut off relations with China, cut ourselves off virtually from the rest of the world, from India, from everyone else, because all of these states are in one way or another doing business with Russia. You know, Turkey's an excellent example. Turkstream is vitally important to the Turks. They want desperately to have that energy. That energy fuels their industry. They're looking at what has happened in Germany, and they're asking themselves, why would we ever do this? Why would we cut ourselves off from Russia? Do we want to follow Germany down into the hell that Germany has created for itself in this allegedly noble crusade against evil Russia? It's a lot of nonsense. Makes no sense. So I think it's all going to fall apart. And at the same time, of course, we're looking at Europe, and we're seeing all these nationalist parties all over the continent who are effectively coming to power increasingly. That is to say, they're reaching a point in terms of popular support that makes it impossible to keep them from power any longer. And the good news is that the kind of nationalism these states are all espousing has nothing to do with attacking anyone. It has everything to do with what is in the interest of their own country, what's good for their societies. How do they protect themselves, their culture, their identity, their way of life, as well as their economic system? And I think this is the death knell of globalism, frankly. And whether President Trump is playing, as his supporters say, 4D chess, urging everybody to do sanctions the way he is, I have no idea. I rather suspect that some people in his administration are probably thinking in terms of, further divorcing certainly Western Europe from Russia and China and other countries. But frankly speaking, I don't see any evidence that that will happen. So I think his plea for everyone else to sanction Russia, sanction China, sanction Turkey, sanction India, and remember, many of the countries that he's determined that we should sanction in one way or another are historic friends, strategic partners of the United States. It doesn't seem to matter anymore. And that's the tragedy of all of this. It goes back to the tariff war that he launched. Suddenly, everyone in the world is treated as the enemy and is subjected to tariffs. There was no discrimination. So again, I fear that he's quite serious, and he's going to be monumentally disappointed because I don't think any of it is going to work.
I'm wondering, though, if you're too optimistic about the Europeans at the moment, because it looks as if Europe has because the times are changing so rapidly, the Europeans have been left in this strategic vacuum that is, they don't really have the ability, it seems, to imagine a world where the collective West does not dominate. So all impulses is to restore the collective hegemony of the 1990s, which isn't achievable. But in the pursuit of this, we now have war with Russia, economic, not just decline, but likely collapse, political legitimacy crisis, a collapse in international relevance. But there seems the underpinning idea is that if we can just defeat the Russians, then everything could be reversed. We could go back to the 90s, the Russians would be weak and do what they're being told. The US would stay in Europe, so we would have, that's kind of our ticket to relevance and prosperity. We would have, in victory, we would also have European unity, and again, the authoritarians would be defeated and liberal democracy would thrive. So this is, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, but the groupthink is organized around this, and reason is gone. And with all this madness, you see all the leaders speaking only in slogans and emotional rhetoric. So I don't hear anyone defining what is the objective, how can we achieve this objective. It's just, well, Russia only respects force. Let's push back, and there's no dissent. No dissent is permitted, essentially. So I'm just wondering, it does seem too crazy for the Europeans to agree to something like this. That is, go to economic, cut themselves off from the entire world, except for the United States, at the time when the US is dictating a bit unfair trade terms to the Europeans. But are you sure that the Europeans won't actually go through with this? Because there's our leaders aren't very rational these days, I would say.
Well, you make a valid point that there's a lot of nostalgia, particularly in Great Britain, in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain. I can't really speak about, potentially somewhat in Germany, but certainly the Western European powers that have a history of imperialism and global power and influence are definitely nostalgic for the world that has long since passed. In the United States, there is no such nostalgia. And I would argue that in much of Europe, that nostalgia is giving way to reason and rationality. What do I mean by that? Well, if you're walking around the streets of Paris right now or London, you're seeing something that is far more damaging and far more dangerous to your country than anything that Russia could conceivably ever mount. And what am I talking about? Well, you're seeing your country fall into the hands of recent migrants who are unalterably opposed to your way of life, to your culture, to your religion. They, in turn, are attempting to set up some facsimile of the country from which they came, the society from which they emerged. This is immediate and it's dangerous. Now, the elites, and when I mean elites, I'm talking about the people largely with money, with the ability to insulate themselves from what happens inside their societies. We have them, you have them. They're not terribly concerned, and they view or they criticize their own populations for their lack of tolerance. Well, they're not being knifed in broad daylight. They're not being assaulted, brutalized, or raped. They're not dealing with this sort of in-your-face cultural assault that people in Great Britain and France and Germany are seeing every day. So I think the population doesn't have much tolerance left. The other thing is that I have never seen, and perhaps you have, I don't know, But in my times in Europe, I have seen no appetite for a knockdown, drag-out war with anybody, least of all Russia. And if you mention to most of the people I know in Germany or Austria, certainly in Central East Europe, let's all march east and go into Ukraine to save Ukraine from the Russians, they look at you as though you've lost your mind. They're happy to send untold quantities of money and cash and equipment as long as it doesn't hurt them economically, obviously, and that's about to bite very hard right now. They don't care. They're not interested in that at all. So I think what we have to do is something that I think President Putin has done. President Putin has exercised a great deal of patience. He's being very patient, waiting for this tide of change to sweep over Europe. It's coming. And President Trump's message to the Europeans is going to accelerate that process. The real question is how soon do Americans wake up and recognize that Washington has led them down a blind alley? And that's one of the reasons that I did write the article that I did today about this shift in global power and influence and wealth to the East. It's not because I'm celebrating the demise of the West in any way, shape, or form. And the West doesn't necessarily have to go down as a result of this. But what the West has to recognize is that there are multiple powers in the world today. There are other poles of influence and strength and power. Just because China or India or Iran or any number of other countries and Russia are now powerful actors on the world stage doesn't translate into danger for us. And that's been the problem now, I would say, certainly since 1991. People want to interpret in Washington, D.C., the emergence of other power centers as inevitably damaging to the United States. That's not true. War, as a means of extending power, of imposing your will, is increasingly, I think, obsolete. It's something that doesn't make sense. And I don't see any evidence that the Chinese or the Russians or the Indians or the Japanese or any number of powers out there are turning to the use of military power to achieve their ends. In fact, I think they're all interested in avoiding it. We are the ones that seem to think that military power is a great tool of statecraft. It's not. You could talk to anybody like Ambassador Freeman, anyone who's been a professional diplomat over the last 30 or 40 years will all say the same thing. In statecraft, in international relations, the military instrument is the least attractive because it's the most difficult to control, and it's the last choice. And we've been using it and using it and using it. We look at the desert we've created as a result of the use of our military power, we declare victory, and we move on. And the people at home in the United States, they don't sense it because they don't feel the pain. Well, that's beginning to change for reasons of economics, because of the financial system and the dangerous and perilous position we're in. And we're not alone. The Europeans are in a very similar position to us economically and financially. So I think all of this is going to come to a halt. But like everything else, when you say that, and you know this, Glenn, from your own experience, people say, well, when is this going to happen? I can't pinpoint the day and time. I'm not Nostradamus. But I think it's pretty obvious that things are going to come to a screeching halt, financially and economically. We can do one of two things. We can jump into a hole and pull the hole down on top of us and hide out and pretend nothing's changed and that we're the greatest. Or we can recognize that the world really has changed. There's a new constellation of powers, and we ought to be part of the new constellation. How do we do that? How do we get into this new constellation of powers? Are we going to sit here in the middle of the Pacific and the Atlantic, thumb our noses at everyone? Or are we going to find a role for ourselves? Instead of looking at the One Belt, One Road program as some sort of fatal danger that has to be combated, insisting that it has purely military utility, which is nonsense, we've got to look at where we fit in. Can we plug into this? Can we offer something? We've got to ask ourselves, what are we going to produce that other people want? What are we going to bring to the table that people respect and are interested in? I think we've got a lot of potential. We seem to have forgotten it. If you go back from the period of world history between 1870 and 1970, everything you enjoy today, from electric lighting to gas heating to automobiles, you name it, all the various vaccinations that do work, these things all have their origins in the United States with brilliant inventions. Well, I think we need to get to work. We need to go to the workbench and start inventing and innovating and get out of this business of trying to figure out how we can bludgeon and bully people to move in whatever direction they want. By the way, there's a great article in the National Interest, and it's by Graham Allison, who makes exactly this point. I think people are figuring this out, but right now, Washington doesn't understand. It's not simply Donald Trump. It's the entire ruling political class.